Bien, pues buenos días a todos nuestros invitados del cuarto Seminario Internacional de Teatro y Espectáculo Irlandés. Es un enorme placer para mí daros la bienvenida a esta actividad cultural dentro del canal de YouTube de la Universidad de La Rioja. Dear students and colleagues, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the fourth International Seminar in Irish Theatre and Performance. This is a new addition to the activities of the Center of Irish Studies, which have been celebrated at the University of La Rioja since 2017. The Center of Irish Studies Banabon, which belongs to EFASIS, which is the European Federation of Associations and Centers for Irish Studies, has partners from the University of Burgos, Deusto and Zaragoza, and has been consolidated over the last 4 years. To explain that title, Bana means bond or link in the Irish language, and it signifies that our philosophy is to join forces and work together to bring about interest in Irish studies in the north-central part of Spain and indeed all over the world. There are a number of entities without whose support the present seminar could not be organized. I would like to thank the following partners for their invaluable collaboration in sponsoring this event. I will start by thanking Vicerrectorado de Estudiantes de la Universidad de La Rioja and Santander Universidades for their generous funding. And our heartfelt gratitude also goes to EMIDUR, Grupo de Investigación GRID, and to EFASIS. And I would like to thank all of them for helping us to make this international seminar a memorable event. The program offers a wide range of topics related to the theme of Irish theatre and performance, and consists of 2 plenary lectures by 2 distinguished professors and widely published academics, Dr. Loredana Sales and Dr. David Clare. And the 2 keynote speakers will examine 2 well-known plays by Irish playwrights Oscar Wilde and Samuel Beckett, and they will talk about their milieu and current performances. Our international seminar will offer researchers and students an opportunity to listen to renowned academics and to exchange ideas in the Q&A in an enriching cross-cultural context. So let me remind you that you can ask our 2 keynote speakers questions at the end of their plenary lectures. So now it's a great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Loredana Sales, who is Associate Professor of English Literature at the University of Sassari and Head of Centro Universitario di Studi Irlandesi, CISR, which belongs to EFASIS too. CISR Center has partners from the University of Turin, Palermo, Florence, and Sassari. Professor Loredana Sales research interests include 19th century gender and exile narratives and adaptations of the canon, and she's published monographs on uses of myth and stage representations of the migrant author in contemporary Irish literature, as well as articles on Gaskell, Martineau, Dickens, Eliot, Mahan, O'Brien, Carr, McGuinness, Morrissey, Heaney, and she's translated Dickens' Theatre and Yates' Prose and Tuffy and the Sail Club, plays by Bernard Shaw. She's also edited Constance Markievicz' Prison Letters and is currently working on Markiewicz's political writings, but in 2019 she edited a monograph issue of Studi Irlandesi, a journal of Irish studies on the Irish diaspora. A board member of ANDA, the Italian Association for English Studies, she also represented Italy in the EFASIS board. And Loredana Sales' talk today is entitled Fortunes and Misfortunes of a Fin de Siècle play, Oscar Wilde's Salome. Loredana, I would like to thank you very much for accepting my invitation. It's a real pleasure and honor to welcome you to the 4th International Seminar in Irish Theatre and Performance this morning. And so we're looking forward to listening to you. So let me stop sharing my screen and then the floor will be yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Melania, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for this generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It is my honor and pleasure to be involved in your international seminar together with my colleague David Clare. I will start sharing my screen, so please confirm that you see everything.
No, I see David and myself.
It's because, how come? Wait, let me try again. I think I cannot minimize the screen. That's why I cannot find the presentation. Yeah, it's because I cannot minimize the screen. Oh, I think I remember from yesterday. Now you should be able to see it.
Now we can see your presentation. So everything is working now.
Yes, thank you so much. And also thank you, Melania, for the invite, of course, and thanks for to everyone who's here with us this morning. So the fortunes and misfortunes of a fin de siècle play, Oscar Wilde's Salome. Oscar Wilde's Salome is a play about a young girl who becomes obsessed with Yochanan, the prophet, and it's an unrequited love. And in the play, she ends up demanding the head of Yochanan once she's been rejected 3 times. The play, Oscar Wilde sets the play on at the end of the day. It's evening time. We are in the palace of Herod, and everyone is celebrating Herod's birthday. Salome is sitting at the table surrounded by the guests. The conversation is rather boring, and also she realizes that she's being looked at by the guests, mostly men of an elderly age, and that is, to her, it's kind of disturbing and annoying. So she leaves the room, goes outside, and reaches to the upper part of the palace where the soldiers are. And once she's up there, the moon, the big white moon being on top of everything, illuminating this scene, she hears the voice of Yochanan. Yochanan is being held captive by Herod, and he is down at the bottom in a cistern. So she becomes almost entranced by the voice of Yochanan. She wants to see him, and once she sees the man, she becomes obsessed with him. And he rejects her 3 times. Now 3 is a key number in the play, a mystical, magical number. And what happens next is that Herod, to celebrate his birthday, he asks Salome to dance for him, and again she refuses 3 times, but then eventually dances the dance of the 7 veils, and as a reward for that, she demands for the head of Yochanan. In the play, Herod, who is not a Christian, but does accept and respect the sanctity of this man, of the prophet, he tries to persuade Salome and offers her everything that he has, the 100 peacocks, to give you an example, and lots of precious stones and everything that, like I said, he owns. But she wants the head of Yochanan, and in the end, she obtains the head of Yochanan. The play ends with a decadent moment when the young girl, who is no longer an innocent adolescent, kisses the head of Yochanan. And Herod, faced with the consequences of that absolutely profane act. It is not the kiss itself, like some critics have maintained, but it is the consequences of having killed the prophet. Faced with that, he orders her killing. Kill that woman, he says in the end. So this is how the play ends. Now, Oscar Wilde wrote the play in 1891. He was in London at the start of the year, and he had just published The Picture of Dorian Gray, and he was just coping with the reception of that decadent novel. He was being exposed in many ways to accusations because of the contents of the novel. And so he took an 8-week break and went to Paris. Paris was the most wonderful city in the world to him. It was the only civilized capital, the only place on earth where you find absolute toleration for all human frailties, with passionate admiration for all human virtues and capacities. So this is where he goes. He goes to a place where he feels safe and where he feels that he can be himself as a man and an artist. And Salome, the creation of Salome, belongs to that environment in several ways. The play was then published in 1893 in the French language and circulated both in France, both in France and in England by the Libraire de l'Art Indépendant in France and Elkin Matthews and John Lane in England, in the UK. The play would then be translated into English by Lord Douglas Bosie, who was Wilde's partner at the time, and published by John Lane. John Lane, the same publisher, the one who will also launch the Yellow Book in that same year. And it was John Lane who commissioned designs by Aubrey Bursley for that edition, for the 1894 edition, English edition of the play. I'll go back to Aubrey Bursley later in this talk, but before that, it's interesting to ask ourselves, why is it that Wilde wrote the play in French? Now, as we know, and probably my colleague, Professor Keller, will say something about Beckett doing something similar. He also wrote in French. But why French? What was French to Oscar Wilde? Well, to begin with, it was a foreign language. And as we know from Adorno, for instance, what happens to you when you speak a foreign language? You have a special occasion to explore uncharted territories. By not being a foreign and a native speaker, Wilde felt that it could allow himself the level of freedom that English and the English environment did not give him. That's one aspect of it. But I think the most important reason for that is that French was to him a musical language as opposed to English. The musicality of this non-native idiom of the French language was crucial to his view of Salome. He really intended Salome, his version of the Salome story, as a musical piece. And I quote from him, "My strange venture," this is how he defines the play, the one-act play, "it's my strange venture in a tongue that is not my own, but that I love as one loves an instrument of music on which one has not played before." Music is a key word, love is the other one. In fact, I think Salome is about love, or to quote from Salome herself, it is about the mystery of love, which is greater than the mystery of death. It is about the love that dare not speak its name. Now, he worked strenuously for that. He, as you can see in this interesting image that Bursley created ad hoc. You see him at work and surrounded by the kind of materials that he was dealing with, that he was handling at the time towards the creation of his Salome. Salome was obviously a topos, a literary topos. Hundreds of writers and artists had revisited that original biblical tale. So he was aware of what and who came before him. In this image, what's interesting here is that the family Bible is there in the foreground. And in fact, that's a starting point as well as a departure point. The way in which Salome's story is recounted in the gospel, most especially by Mark and by Matthew's. But as well as that, he looks at the way in which Salome's story was recounted by symbolist writers in France and across over in America as well. We'll look at a list of writers who influenced Wilde in a minute. But before we move on to that, it's interesting to see that as well as Flaubert and Swinburne, symbolist writers that he was highly inspired by, he is surrounded by his own Dorian Gray. There's a link, there's a thematic coherence between the novel and the play. Certainly the decadent quality of the narrative is there. And then all you have is a French dictionary and books of French grammar books that he used extensively. The quality of his language was the quality of a non-native speaker. In fact, he gave the draft to a couple of friends, poets, both of them symbolist poets and anarchists. They were engagé writers, and they approved of the language. It's significant that none of them changed Wilde's French, retaining or suggesting to him that he should retain the exotic quality of his language, which then contributes to creating that sort of hypnotic quality of the speeches we have in the French edition of the play. Another reason for writing French, apart from the musicality and the possibilities given to him to experiment with a language and a medium that he was interested and fascinated with, was of course his ambition to become one of the French symbolist writers himself. That was his ambition. But in the end, what happens is that the play gets published in the French language, and shortly after that, it gets translated into English, like I said. Among the sources, just to give you an example, we have, you see, Stéphane Mallarmé's poem Erodeus, as well as Flaubert's short story, the one that is was published in the Traconte in 1877, that you have in the Bursley image, and other titles here. What's interesting here to see is the emphasis on Erodeus. Erodeus become a central figure in Wilde's Salome. In departing from the original source, the biblical source, that's what happens. The attention that is given to Erodeus. And the other crucial aspect is the way in which Salome and Salome's relationship to her mother is recounted. In the original source, in the biblical source, Salome demands the head of Yochanan because of her mother, but not here. Here, Erodeus is a central presence, she is a dominant figure in the play. But the reason why Salome demands the head of Yochanan is because she develops an obsession. She wants him, and because she cannot have him, she will have the head of Yochanan, and she will end up kissing the head of Yochanan. And another important and crucial source is definitely Gustave Moreau's representation. Moreau represents Salome in different paintings. One of them Wilde had an opportunity to see at the opening of the Grosvenor Gallery in London, and he reviewed that painting later on for the Dublin University magazine. He then came across again that painting through des Esseintes' description, meticulous description, hypnotic description in Arrebour, a novel that was published in 1884 in France and which Wilde had read. In addition to that, there's a poem, Salome, by the American writer, a dramatic poem by Highwood, which was reviewed again by Wilde in 1888, and also Maurice Maeterlinck's La Princesse Malène of 1889, the work of a symbolist Belgian playwright that Wilde evidently admired. Now, what was the outcome? What was the play received? What was the reception? Well, it was mixed, I must admit. Some picked up the musical quality. They did understand. In general terms, the reception, the play was misunderstood at the start. It's a complex play. And it was largely misunderstood. I think it was overshadowed by Wilde's own reputation in many ways. There was a prejudice towards him, and therefore there was a prejudice towards anything that he wrote. It's early days, but we're going towards the trials, and the atmosphere was of great high skepticism towards him. Now, Le Gallienne recognized the musicality of it. It seems to me to be built to music, he said. Its gradual growth is exactly like the development of a theme in music. By the same token, James Joyce defined the play an opera, a polyphonic variation on the rapport of art and nature. What James Joyce sees is also the self-referential, the autobiographical dimension to this play, the same time a revelation of his Wilde's own psyche. And it's not just about the homoerotic dimension of the play. It is about Wilde's own reflection on love, the meaning of love and happiness, and whether one excludes the other, or whether you can be happy while being in love. That's really central to his narrative. To Maeterlinck, the author of the story we saw that mentioned in the list, to Maeterlinck, the symbolist Belgian playwright, it was a theft. He felt, and he wrote in the New York Critic, that Wilde had stolen from him. Yeats didn't really appreciate the use of the language. To him, the dialogue is empty, sluggish, and pretentious. And it's quite interesting because Yeats will later he will make a similar choice by drawing from the Japanese no. He will use a kind of language that it's equally hypnotic. It's very similar to this experimental language that Wilde uses in Salome. Wilde defended himself the usual way, in an ironic, light way, by saying, for instance, that he plagiarized because in the end he appreciated the works that he was looking, and he wrote this in a letter to Max Beerbohm. This critiques the fact that the play was misunderstood has to do with the prejudice against Wilde in a way, but it also has to do with the translation itself. In the transition from the French to the English, what happens inevitably is that something gets lost. To translate, it was Lord Douglas who translated the play in English, and it probably has to do with his inability to retain the essence, the quality of the original language. And Bursley was good in doing that. Bursley's designs somehow managed to fill in for that loss. Bursley picked on the essence of Wilde's play, and he created ad hoc designs which managed to somehow express what Wilde was really trying to do when revisiting Salome. And I'll give you a few examples which are crucial to our understanding of the reception of the play, of its fortunes and misfortunes up until recent. Now, the first plate that I have chosen, there's about 16 plates. Not all of them got published. Some of them were censored. And about censorship, you probably need to remember that the Lord Chamberlain in England prohibited the staging of the play on using as an excuse, if you like, the fact that the play revolved on a biblical theme. Now, the first plate, as you see, represents the moment when Erodeus enters. What you see here is the central figure. She's taller than anyone, and the distinctive traits here are the big breasts, a reference to her sexuality, which is condemned in the play by Yochanan. The body is half naked or barely covered by some sort of veil. There's a Japanese theme here that sort of covers part of her body. And then the abundance of her hairdo. She's represented here as a femme fatale, a virago, a woman, a man-eater, if you like, a man-hating and a man-eating, a sort of morbid, narcissistic kind of woman. In this image, she is flanked by two male figures, and then there's a third figure here at the bottom. The first is the one that we are most interested in when looking at the fortunes and misfortunes of the play. This is the page of Erodeus. The page of Erodeus is represented here as an adolescent young guy. And if you look at the details, he is gazing, he's looking directly at her naked body, but he is totally unaroused by that. Even though Bursley had to add a fig leaf to cover the intimate parts of the page of Erodeus, it is quite evident that this young adolescent guy is not does not react. He's totally, like I said, unaroused by the sight of Erodeus' naked body, as opposed to the other figure, the fetus head figure. Now, this is a common. The fetus head is found in other designs by Aubrey Bursley. It echoes the fact that his sister had miscarried. She lost her baby. This second figure is fascinating not only because of the fetus head and because of you see here the paw. It's an echo of the goat pan. It's a goat's paw, basically. But what we are interested in here is that, unlike the page boy, he is evidently aroused by the presence of Erodeus and by the fact that she is half naked. She is exposing this her half naked body. At the bottom of the image, what we have is a jester, the Joker. And it's a caricature of Wilde himself. Wilde is present in more than one of the plays of Aubrey Bursley's play. And he is approving of the two reactions. He is approving of the fetus-headed characters as opposed to the other figure. He is pointing at him as well as pointing at the 3 candles, again 3 being a crucial number here, the 3 candles being a phallic symbol, as you can see. We know that this is Wilde also because he's holding a copy of the Salome play. Now, the page boy is a protagonist in Bursley, in another one of Bursley's plays. Now, the critics dismissed him. He is always treated as a secondary, minor character because he's a page, the page of Erodeus. He's a page boy. But he is not secondary at all. In the Platonic lament, he is represented here while mourning Naraboth. Naraboth is the Syrian soldier who takes his life when he sees that Salome is wants Yochanan. It's a reaction he has, and he takes his life unexpectedly. Now, nobody really says much about that moment. It happens at the start of the play. Nobody really says nothing about it. People seem to be more concerned about his corpse because Herod doesn't like to see dead bodies in the palace unless he has killed the person. So they're more preoccupied with discarding with the corpse. Naraboth, the page of Erodeus, on the other hand, mourns the body. And it is in that moment in the play when he cries for the death of Naraboth that we suspect that there is a sort of platonic love to unite them. A platonic love, a love that is platonic because it cannot be realized in real life. It can only be platonic. Fin de siècle society is not prepared to accept that kind of homosexual love. And it is not platonic in a spiritual way because it is not corresponded. But it is nevertheless approved within the economy of the play. And we know that because here you see there's the moon, and the face of the moon is again a caricature of Wilde himself. And what we see is that a rose is falls from the sky. This is the rose tree uniting the ground, the earth, and the sky where the moon is. And the donation of a flower, the rose, is a sign perhaps of Wilde's recognition of the place, recognition of the possibility for that love to be more than just platonic. I'll go quickly to the next slide to show you how Bursley viewed Salome quite coherently. As you see, like daughter, like mother, like daughter, equally Salome, the moment when she dances the dance of the 7 veils, she is represented the way in which her mother was represented, her body being half naked, the breasts and the navels being uncovered. And this is the veil, one veil which possibly covers. And when that veil is lifted, what happens is we see the god Pan, the great god Pan. And by the way, Arthur Machen published with John Lane that novella in 1894, the same year as when the play, Wilde's play Salome, was being published in the English version. We know that she is dancing because of the shape of her body, because of the movement, the sinuous movements of her body. See the naked feet here, the Japanese designs return, the rose, the peacock feathers are re-echoed in the design. But what's interesting to look at is this, the musical element. The musician here playing a two-stringed instrument, which is a hybrid. It's a combination, a conflation of different musical traditions and different styles of music. You have the Indian sitar, you have the Ottoman baglama, you have the Chinese eru, and you also have the Western violin. And it is to this exotic, hypnotic music that she dances. And this is the reward. This is what she gets in the end for dancing the dance of the seven veils. Now, the trials of Wilde, the trials of Oscar Wilde, Bursley's design, the Yellow Book, and all of the mayhem that these events and publications caused really had a significant effect on the fortunes and misfortunes of the play. It took some time before it could be premiered. The first production took place in France, based on the French edition. It was 1896. By then, Wilde was already in jail, and he obviously could not attend. In fact, he never attended while he was alive. He managed to give instructions to Sarah Bernhardt as to the way in which she should perform Salome. One of the issues being the play was apparently written for Sarah Bernhardt, or Sarah Bernhardt asked to play the title role. But the question being that Salome in the play is a young girl of about 12 years of age, while Sarah Bernhardt was 40 years of age at the time. So that was one of the major challenges for her as an actress. Wilde apparently had nothing to say with regards to the director's decision to have a woman playing the part of the page of Erodeus. And this is very important because it stayed like this for quite some times. When Richard Strauss himself adapted the play to the opera, he also envisioned the page of Erodeus as a woman. In the London premiere that same year, in 1905, the part of the page of Erodeus was played by a woman. It was a misunderstanding, perhaps, or perhaps it was a way of downplaying the homoerotic value of the play itself. It was easier to say that the page of Erodeus had feelings for Narraboth if his role was being played by a woman. It was nonetheless a controversial issue. And that is reflected in the reception of the play in years to come. In 1977, Lindsay Kemp staged his Salome with an all-male production. It seems to me like an attempt to even out the scale. So what you have is all the roles being played by men actors. This was followed, another interesting production was in 1988, Steven Berkoff's Salome, which owes much to Lindsay Kemp, of course, and both of them owe much to Aubrey Bursley's interpretation, and therefore to his designs. We're going to go back to each single production. And then more recently, the 2011 production or enterprise experimental docufilm and stage production by Al Pacino, the Wilde Salome. Let's have a look at them in detail. Melania, sorry, just how am I doing with time?
Now it's 10 past 10.
Right.
So it would be great if you could finish as soon as possible, but
right.
no
Okay.
worries.
Yeah, we may skip the videos themselves. I'll just give you a brief, even though we miss a lot. I mean, these links are available. Clips of the 3 productions can be seen, are accessible on YouTube. So we are going to skip them today now. Because of time, but it is interesting to look at them. Now, Lindsay Kemp had been working on Salome for quite some time. He started about in 1933, and in the end, he staged the play. He staged the play several times, by the way. In 1977, the post and the poster 1977 editions are interesting. Now, what you see here and what you will see, you have a chance to see in the video, in the clip, the YouTube clip that's available here, is what? Lindsay Kemp playing the part of the young princess of Judea, Salome, and here's Erodeus. I think, I mean, it doesn't really need to be commented because you see the similarity between Erodeus here and the Erodeus that was depicted by Bursley. What does Kemp do, apart from respecting Bursley's design, is also respecting Wilde's need to make this as a musical piece. Music has a central role in Kemp's revisitation of the play, as well as that it's an exotic music, like the one that was probably being played by the musician in the plate, the Bursley plate that we have seen. Herodias is represented, like I said, as a virago, a monstrous, a man-eating woman, and Herod is a king to a place, to a kingdom that is decadent, to a place, the kingdom of degeneracy. And by the way, we need to remember that Max Nordau wrote Degeneration Entertained in 1892. The book was translated in 1893 in most European languages, including Italian and French, and it would be translated in English in 1895. A whole chapter is dedicated to Wilde. So Wilde, to Max Nordau, was a degenerate by definition. The execution of Yochanan is especially cruel, with blood pouring out of his mouth in this edition, this version of the play. Skipping off to Berkhoff, just to say a few things about this. The costumes, contemporary, the colors, a stark contrast between white and black, same as in the Aubrey-Bursley's design, and blue. By contrast, red is the color that represents Salome, as well as Herodias. You see here the lipstick and the earring, red-haired girl here, and red replicated here in the costume, in what Herodias is wearing here. Characters move slowly. Slow motion is a feature, a dominant feature in this edition, in this production of the play. Miming. Berkhoff uses heavy mime. This is Berkhoff himself, and you see how the faces are painted in white. It's the equivalent of the mask, the representation of a society where you play a part no matter what. It's a highly controversial but also very influential production, which also uses music as crucial to the narrative. Now, in Lindsay Kemp, verbal language is reduced to a 20% of the final production script. Here, language is also reduced, and it is compensated by the movement of the body, the slow motion, this hypnotic, almost somnolent atmosphere that is recreated in the performance. Now, this is available as a clip on YouTube, as a video, a film, a DVD of it was made out of the 1992 production in Tokyo. It can be actually accessed online through a digital theater website. To come to the end of this presentation, and I apologize for taking longer than I should have, Pacino comes from a long line of Salomes. And what he does here, he pays a tribute to the man and his work, to the attempt in that highly controversial and fin de siècle to give voice, to express the complexity of love, like I said, the mystery of love, as Wilde put it. Now, Wilde Salome, to begin, it's interesting because it plays with the homophone Wilde, the surname, and Wild as an adjective. I think Pacino uses wild as an adjective the way in which Yeats himself used that adjective, as something that is spontaneous, natural, that is controversial, that is anarchist in a way. It's the idea of the triumph of anarchy as freedom, as a choice of freedom. Again, he owes much, Al Pacino owes very much to Berkoff, as well as Lindsay Kemp, as well as Nazimova's silent 1923 silent movie, as well as Aubrey Bursley. Characters are dressed in contemporary, as you see, outfits. Red is the color that dominates or represents the sky and the protagonist. And you have the kiss, the lethal kiss, if you like, the kiss. This is the head of Yokonan on the civil plate, and this is Chastain, the actress. What's interesting about this enterprise is like I said, the attempt on Al Pacino's part to pay a tribute to Wilde, the man and the artist. It is self-referential in many ways, but it is also absolutely brilliant. The quality of the acting is outstanding. It really is worth watching this one, and this is also available on DVD. And before I thank you all for your attention, and I apologize again for taking this time to come to this conclusion, Salome was meant to be an icon of fin de siècle and of contemporary female self-assertion and desire vis-à-vis a patriarchal modern state that was corrupted. It is because of that state that Yokonan dies. It is not because of Salome's wild desire. The play is about the voiceless and the nameless, the page of Erodeus being an icon of that. And then it is also an autobiographical work with reference to Wilde's public persona as an engagé writer, as a socialist, as an anarchist, as an aesthete, as a dandy, an Irishman who in many ways was speaking against the empire from within the empire. And I think I'll stop here. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk, Loredana. It's lovely to have the chance to hear your thoughts about Oscar Wilde's work in general and his play, Salome, in particular. So now I would like to present our. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So our second keynote speaker today is Dr. David Clare, who is lecturer in drama and theatre studies at Mary Immaculate College, University of Limerick, and he previously held 2 Irish Research Council-funded postdoctoral fellowships at NUI Galway. Dr. Clare's books include the monographs Bernard Shaw, Irish Outlook, and Irish Anglican Literature and Drama, Hybridity and Discord, both published by Palgrave. And and also the edited collections, the Theatre, Dublin Inspiration and Craft, and quite recently 2 volumes entitled The Golden Thread, Irish Women Playwrights, from 1716 to 2016. So, but he is also, excuse me, curator of the Irish Research Council funded database, classic plays, and he's also delivered over 80 conference papers and public lectures across the world since 2009. Excuse me, Dr. Clare's publications related to the subject of today's talk, Samuel Beckett, include journal articles in the Irish University Review or New Hibernian Review, and an Irish Quarterly Review, and also a book chapter in the edited collection Staging Beckett in Ireland and Northern Ireland, published by Bloomsbury. He's got reviews in the Journal of Beckett Studies and the James Joyce Literary Supplement. But today's talk is entitled Irish Traces in Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. And here he'll focus on the Irish aspects of Beckett's Waiting for Godot, which must not distract us from the wider European and indeed global concerns being explored in the script. So, David, I will stop sharing my my screen, and then the floor will be yours. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation, and we're looking forward to listening to you.
Well, thanks very much, Melania. It's so great to be part of this international seminar and to get a chance to talk about Beckett, who's always very interesting to speak about. And I'm bringing up my PowerPoint now. Hopefully it'll appear without too many hitches. Okay, doesn't seem to be coming up there. That's strange. I wonder why that's not coming up. I'll do one other way.
There we are. Just
at last.
Yeah, just close the black square.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Great.
Thank you.
Excellent. So, as Melania suggested, my talk today is about the Irish traces in Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. And this is a play that was originally written in French by a man from an Anglo-Irish ascendancy background. And so therefore, there could be, kind of aspersions cast as to the depth of his authentic Irishness. But I hope to prove here today that Irishness is actually laced through the play in very important ways. So, who was Samuel Beckett? Well, he was born into an Anglo-Irish Church of Ireland family in Foxrock, County Dublin, which is a very wealthy suburb south of the Dublin city centre. And you'll see there that I have Anglo-Irish in inverted commas or in scare quotes. And that's because I don't really like that term so much. It's a term that has been applied to people from a Church of Ireland background. And it's true that people from that background were the ascendancy. That is, they were Britain's representatives in Ireland and were given special privileges in colonial Ireland when the whole island was ruled by Britain. And yet that term Anglo-Irish doesn't totally take into account the strong sense of Irishness that so many writers from Church of Ireland backgrounds had over centuries of residence in Ireland. So I usually prefer Irish Anglican, and so you'll hear me use that because the Church of Ireland is part of the global Anglican communion. Now, I suppose, though, the reputation hovers around people from this demographic that they were kind of privileged people. And while it's true that many who would have owned the big houses and the big estates in Ireland, or most of the people who owned the big houses, big estates in Ireland, would have been from this ascendancy Church of Ireland background. There were actually people of all social classes who have been part of the Church of Ireland community and demographic on the island of Ireland right up to this very day. And so to associate folks from this background exclusively with wealth and privilege doesn't really tell the whole story. But what is interesting is that demographic in the main, because for centuries they were granted more rights, more economic privileges, more educational privileges, they did actually have a better lot than, for instance, their Catholic or Presbyterian or Jewish neighbors, etc. And this did not sit well with artists of a sensitive nature who came from this demographic. And many of the most famous Irish writers actually were from this Irish Anglican background. And many of those famous names would have been people who were so uncomfortable with that sense of privilege that they were granted as members of the ascendancy that they actually even turned to socialism. So Oscar Wilde would have been a self-declared socialist, as would J.M. Synge and Bernard Shaw. And Beckett, like these writers, would have shown great concern for those left behind by what social scientists called competition economics. And that's the reason why Samuel Beckett, in his work, is so attracted to the figure of the tramp. The tramps feature heavily in the play I'm talking about today, Waiting for Godot, but you can also find them in works like Rough for Theatre 2 and the Four Novellas, etc. And I suppose, even though Beckett himself was not from a big house family, that is, did not grow up in a huge estate with loads of tenants or anything like that, he was, like others from a middle-class background from this former ascendancy, haunted by the specter of the big house and by the fact that his ancestors would have been implicated with the unjust rule that prevailed in Ireland for centuries and the economic privilege that people from a Church of Ireland background would have enjoyed thanks to dictates from London. And that specter of the big house can be seen in Beckett's work, sometimes very obviously, for instance, in a novel like What, which is actually set in an Irish big house, but also even plays such as Endgame and Footfalls could actually be seen as people rattling around in a big house that has fallen on hard times. And sort of the decline of the big house is a common theme that you often find among Irish Anglican writers, maybe especially the work of Irish women writers from that background, such as Maria Edgeworth, Somerville and Ross, Elizabeth Bowen, Molly Keane, etc. Beckett was very aware that he came from this very specific Irish Anglican demographic, and he actually, kind of shows his debts to important writers from this background in his work repeatedly. For instance, Jonathan Swift would be a presence from early works such as Fingal, all the way up through arguably a work like Play, which could arguably be said to be inspired by the love triangle that Swift found himself in with the two women in his life. Tipperary-born Lawrence Sterne and his classic novel Tristram Shandy also seems to lend some of the madcapness to some of Beckett's more humorous works. 18th century Irish playwrights in London were of an interest to Beckett, especially during his time living in London in the 1930s. And in fact, the first play that he properly attempted during his professional writing career, Human Wishes, is ostensibly about Dr. Samuel Johnson and his circle, but the play fragment fixates itself really in some ways on Irish playwrights in London, such as Oliver Goldsmith, Hugh Kelly, Arthur Murphy, etc. Yeats was a presiding presence over Beckett's work throughout his career. He might have dissed Yeats quite heavily in an essay called Recent Irish Poetry quite early in his career, but as late as 1977, the Yeats poem The Tower is actually inspiring his play, But the Clouds. Lady Gregory is an important presence in the sense that she really was the one to bring to the Irish canon, with works like The Jailgate, the use of the act of waiting as a central dramatic device. J.M. Synge was so important to Beckett that at the end of his life, his biographer James Knowlson asked him who was ultimately the most important influence on you, and the name that he reached for was Synge. And even late in his life was said to be able to recite some of Synge's poetry about the beauties of North County Wicklow, a landscape beloved to Beckett and his father. So that shows, again, the Synge influence. And Sean O'Casey was another writer whose knockabout farces, as Beckett put it, were important to him. So in a way, he kind of was aware that he was plugging in to not just maybe Irish tradition in his work, but a specific Irish Anglican tradition, one in which the writers were, again, wrestling with the sense of privilege and perhaps guilt that they had over acts committed by their ancestors, and even maybe the privilege that they still enjoyed. So when I went to study at University College Dublin and later at NUI Galway, I found that the main section in each of the libraries that contained the bulk of Beckett's work were actually the French sections. And it seemed like these two prominent Irish institutions were actually making the point that Beckett should be seen predominantly as a French writer. And so I suppose here we wander into the territory of, what is exactly the placing that we should have for Samuel Beckett in terms of his, I suppose, national affiliations. Well, Beckett's writings throughout his life draw on his love of the Irish landscape, a love that was inculcated in him through very, very long walks into the Dublin Mountains and on into North Wicklow, which he took with his father, and which he would, kind of continue to do even after his father's passing. And that he said late in his life he would even go through in his mind. He would walk some of those walks. And even in late works, when Beckett made the decision to, if you like, internationalize the proceedings by stripping out lots of proper nouns and lots of proper noun place names, etc., you could still, if you know these areas, recognize very easily where he is describing in, say, North Wicklow or the Dublin Mountains, etc. Beckett's work, even later in his life, speaks to his negative views regarding the new emerging Irish state and the kind of conservatism that reigned, but also what were called the Irish Ireland tendencies, which is the fact that there was a great promotion exclusively of the culture of the Irish Gaelic Catholic majority. And so there wasn't room for people who, despite having been resident in Ireland for centuries, kind of would have regarded themselves as Irish, but whose cultural inheritance did have British elements as a result, for instance, of their membership of the Irish Anglican community. And, even if you're talking about the north of Ireland, people from, say, an Ulster Scots Presbyterian background that would also have a British cultural inheritance alongside their Irish one, there was no room for that. And so Beckett really had trouble with the kind of attempt to almost impose a monoculture on the state after independence. And as we've seen, he was very influenced by the Irish writers he loved. So all of this would have bolstered certainly his own sense of his Irishness, but his sense of his Irishness was also, kind of made much stronger by the time he lived in London on and off between 1933 and 1936, when he was in therapy over the kind of very, very difficult relationship he had with his highly religious mother. Because he said that during his time there in London, he really hated it because he hated the way that he was, and this is his words, he was called Pat or Paddy in every shop that he went into. And what's interesting about this is those of us, kind of who would be familiar with what has been called the Protestant accent or the Trinity accent, who would be aware of people from Beckett's background, who would have, like Beckett, attended a private school like Portora Royal School up in Enniskillen, County Fermanagh, and later Trinity College Dublin, there would be a certain amount of poshness and a certain even amount of Britishness in the background. And therefore, the fact that these English folks that he ran into did not recognize that at all, but saw him exclusively as a Paddy, really would have sharpened that sense of his own Irishness. Now, he did, of course, settle in France, and after 1946, as has already been alluded to, he did write quite a bit in French. He wrote roughly half his work. Some people, there's a kind of cliche out there that he just turned totally to French, but actually he wrote a lot of works in English after that. And I suppose I mentioned already the fact that in those later works, he often strips out lots of proper names and lots of proper nouns and lots of place names, etc. He vagans the work. And in doing that, people have argued that he basically sets the work nowhere, even when the landscapes are recognizably Irish, or he even leaves in Irish place names, such as Croker's Acres or Carrick Mines or the Ballyogan Road or whatever. So I suppose for critics who come down on the side of wanting to argue that Beckett is not Irish, but should be seen as sort of either French or some sort of internationalist, modernist, they often land back on the same quotes as proof, quote unquote, that Beckett is not really Irish. Beckett once said, "The true artist is from nowhere. He has no kith." But of course, every artist doesn't necessarily want to be pigeonholed exclusively by their nationality. In fact, J.M. Singh, who is an extremely national writer, if you want to put it that way, in terms of his Irishness, once said that the true artist is from Bohemia. And he didn't mean Eastern Europe, he meant artistic Bohemia. In a particularly bitter letter from 1938, when he was having to stay with his mother, who he always had the fraught relationship with, this was on a holiday back in Ireland, he referred to Ireland as the land of my unsuccessful abortion. So, very strongly worded there. And he was actually in Ireland when World War II broke out. And so he therefore had the choice to stay in neutral Ireland all through the conflict if he wanted to. And yet he chose to return to Paris, where he took part in the French resistance. And when asked about it years later, he said, "I prefer France at war to Ireland at peace," which again speaks to that alienation he would have felt in a state that in the middle decades of the 20th century was rife with censorship, and which was kind of a repressive environment for the artist in many ways, but also kind of would have frowned upon, again, folks from his particular Irish demographic and background. That said, the Irishness never left him. He kept his Irish passport and described himself only as a guest in France. And there's interesting examples of him writing letters, for instance, to the man who eventually became Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, kind of speaking about the fact of him kind of, if you like, renewing not just his passport, but his kind of affirming his guest status. He followed the Irish rugby team. And while he did, as I mentioned, work for the French resistance during World War II and even won the Croix de Guerre for his heroic efforts in that resistance cell in Paris before it was broken up, he also, after the war, chose to work for the Irish Red Cross up in Normandy. And again, there's that kind of link back to Irishness. Now, the kind of, if you like, lazy assumption that these later works are set nowhere is kind of painting with a big broad brush over the complexities of what's actually happening in terms of settings, if you want to call them that, in the later works. Because if we look carefully at his, especially later plays, we can see that some are set in purgatorial spaces, such as Waiting for Godot, and such as Play. And some are set in the real world. For instance, the play All That Fall is very clearly set in a fictionalized version of Fox Rock called Bog Hill. And some are set in what critics have called skullscapes, where we're basically inside the minds of the characters. And this stage picture that Beckett has, painted in the particular play is, if you like, depicting the psychology or the inner mind and life of the protagonist being assessed, analyzed, depicted, etc. So I suppose the funny thing about Beckett's kind of sometimes tenuous ties to the Irish canon, as far as certain critics are concerned, means that sometimes when you'll read a study of Irish theater history, Beckett will be kind of maybe either not dealt with much at all, in the sense of they say that he's not really part of the tradition, or they will actually make a point of talking about it, but also saying, by the way, his work doesn't really fit. Now, that seems maybe increasingly funny to us because of the fact that so many contemporary playwrights, such as Marina Carr and Enda Walsh and Mark O'Halloran and Marco Rowe and maybe too many others to name, would obviously be heavily indebted to Beckett. and therefore he is in many ways the presiding genius over lots of contemporary Irish theatre work. I mean, I can even think of the Palestinian Irish playwright Hannah Khalil and the allusions to Happy Days that we get in her play A Museum in Baghdad. And yet, I wouldn't just emphasize Beckett's influence on the playwrights that came after him in tying him to the Irish canon. I would suggest that he actually is, if you like, a manifestation of an experimental strain. And I'm not the first to say this, of course, an experimental strain in Irish drama, which went back to the Irish literary revival. And it shows that his work, which seems very strange at first, like if we see a play like Waiting for Godot, which I could remember, you know, borrowing it from a high school English teacher, and it was like my brain was getting washed because it was so straight back, so bare, and yet there was that dark humor running through it. But again, it was set in this kind of strange non-place, etc. And it can seem like something that's landed from Mars, especially when it premiered in the Théâtre de Babylon in 1953. But, you know, there is actually precedence for it in the Irish canon. And there's a clues to those Irish precedents or antecedents in a quote that Beckett wrote on a postcard to the actor Cyril Cusack when Cusack asked Beckett for a tribute to celebrate Bernard Shaw's centenary, his 100th birthday. Beckett wrote back, "I wouldn't suggest that GBS, George Bernard Shaw, is not a great playwright, whatever that is when it's at home. What I would do is give the whole unupsettable apple cart for a sup of the Hawkswell or the Saints or a whiff of Juno to go no further." Now, this is pretty serious diss of Shaw. He actually had a play called The Apple Cart, which is what Beckett's alluding to, but also calling it the unupsettable apple cart kind of stereotypes Shaw's work as being very controlled and the kind of the product of that very organized mind that Shaw had. Obviously, I think much more of Shaw's work, having written a book about him, than Beckett did. But let's look at the work that Beckett is praising. At the Hawkswell was one of those kind of Japanese no-play influenced plays that W.B. Yeats wrote. And The Well of the Saints is a great play, a masterpiece really by J.M. Singh. And Juno and the Peacock is a great play by Sean O'Casey. So here he is specifically giving a shout out to Yeats, Singh, and O'Casey in this quote, and showing that he prefers a particular strain of theirs. He's not necessarily mentioning works of theirs. Well, Juno was a huge hit, but he's kind of mentioning works of theirs that kind of were probably a bit edgy for the main and plain Abbey-going audience. So if you put that quote together with the fact that Beckett actually attended the opening night of Yeats's Purgatory at the Abbey in 1938, you can see that Godot actually has a significant Irish pedigree. So let's think about the bickering duos in, you know, some of the works of the earlier Irish playwrights, such as that duo that we get centrally in Waiting for Godot. Many people will be like, you know, oh, hey, this is just your basic, you know, kind of comedic duo like you might get in British music hall or, you know, even in American films. And that must be exclusively what Beckett is alluding to and drawing on. But of course, there's bickering duos in Synge's The Well of the Saints, the blind couple that sit by the side of the road and whinge and get up to mischief. There's Lady Gregory's plays, including the aforementioned The Workhouse Ward and The Jailgate, and the fact that, you know, again, you've got these kind of two people, in one case with The Workhouse Ward, two men, and in the case of The Jailgate, two women who are kind of verbally sparring. And again, The Jailgate, as I said earlier, kind of has that device of the act of waiting. Yeats is at the Hawkswell also has the device of waiting, and there we've got Cuchulainn and an old man kind of waiting for this fountain of youth to spring water. And Purgatory has a father and son standing by a burnt-out big house, again, waiting for something to happen and caught in a purgatorial space. O'Casey's Juno the Peacock famously has the two boys, Joxer and the Peacock, kind of getting up to some of their slapstick antics and their verbal pyrotechnics. And, you know, there's, you know, a great pedigree we see there of these bickering duos that feed into the work of Beckett with Waiting for Godot and later works as well. The purgatorial setting of Yeats's Purgatory is again a feature of Waiting for Godot, as we'll talk about. The fact that the tramps there are talking about the fact that they seem to be having this same day over and over again. I mean, as the Irish critic Vivian Mercier once said, Godot is a play in which nothing happens twice. And that's really this idea that the same day or a similar day is happening over and over again. And they talk about the void, and they talk about the previous day having been in another compartment, and all these kind of strange things which suggest we're not in the real world. We could also argue that the existentialist or proto-existentialist conversations about the meaning of existence in Yeats's At the Hawk's Well feed into works like Waiting for Godot, where they're not just trying to pass the time, similar to Cuchulainn and the Old Man, but they are actually wrestling very seriously with what life is all about. And for instance, in an early draft of At the Hawk's Well, towards the end of the play, one of the characters says, in the end, life feels like a preparation for something that never happens. And in a lot of ways, that could be a summary of Waiting for Godot. And then, we could talk about the Christian imagery and symbolism that is there rife through all these different works. So St. Gregory Yates and O'Casey all would have been from Church of Ireland backgrounds, and there would have been lots of, if you like, Bible or wrestling with the Christianity of their families and forebears in a lot of the works. And Beckett himself returns time and again to Christian imagery, and a lot of this, of course, would be related to the fact that his mother was such a fervent evangelical believer and very much tried to impose her religion on him, but he found that he simply could not believe it, whereas his brother Frank was actually able to believe. Beckett, wrestled with this and yet did not become a believer himself. He famously said that when it came to the pinch, he saw that the Anglican faith of his mother and brother, when they were dying, was of no more use than an old school tie, which of course is a very pointed comment. I mean, not only are we talking about the fact that you don't need your old school tie anymore when you get into later life, but he's also alluding, of course, to that British tradition, especially in British public schools, which are in fact private schools, in which people that went to Eton or Harrow or wherever would recognize each other by the fact that they were wearing the old school tie. And so therefore, you would get special privileges, for instance, in a job interview, if somebody could spot that you were wearing the old school tie. So he's associating that Church of Ireland background, that ascendancy background, with a degree of privilege and snobbery, and kind of is implicitly wondering if that's not part of the attraction to it for people from that particular background, beyond whatever spiritual consolations they might get, that he certainly himself would like to get, but can't bring himself to believe. So again, we might be talking about Waiting for Godot, this play which is originally written in French, and which, kind of very much seems to be set in some sort of non-space, as being this kind of, if you like, exclusively internationalist work, or one where you could say he has kind of walked away from his Irishness in the name of being a good internationalist modernist or a good European. And yet we do see traces of the characters' lives through their mentioning, for instance, of real geographical settings. There are French references, for instance, to the Eiffel Tower, the Macon country, the Pyrenees, etc., to the use of francs. There's British references, such as the references in Lucky's speech to Peckham, Fulham, and Clapham, and the made-up Feckham. There's references to sports that the Gaelic Athletic Association in Ireland would have regarded as quote-unquote foreign games, such as hockey and golf. And then there's international references as well, for instance, to the Cunard line of ships, Steinway pianos. There's music and dance terms from international art music. And this is something that's often passed over when people are keen to kind of suppress the Irish aspects of the play. There are very specific Irish references. For instance, there's a reference to Captain Peterson's pipe, and you can still see the sign for Captain Peterson's Tobacconists in O'Connell Street, and the business itself is now Peterson's and is actually across the river now in Dublin too. There's a reference to camogie, and that's one of those Gaelic Athletic Association games. There's Bishop Berkeley getting a mention in Lucky's speech, and he's an important philosopher whose idea that to be is to be perceived comes up in many, many Beckett works, including here in Gatto, but even in works like play and film, etc. And of course, there's the very stirring, moving, repeated references to the skull and Connemara in Lucky's speech, which many critics, I think, have rightly seen as a famine reference. And in the original French version, he talks about the skull in Normandy. And as I say, he would have served with the Irish Red Cross in Normandy, specifically in Saint-Lô, a town that had been reduced to rubble by the conflict, a capital of the ruins, as Beckett called it. And therefore, it's an image rife with human suffering. And in the English language version, in choosing to fixate on Connemara, a place he would have visited with his brother Frank, he's very much kind of evoking for many people that the hauntedness of a place that had seen so much death through especially the Great Hunger of 1845 to 1852. The other thing that needs to be noted, of course, is that in translating from French, a language that Beckett took on for many reasons, but one of them was the fact that, he felt he could write in a more stripped back way in French. And once said that he wrote in French because it had no style. Now, of course, that's a comedic overstatement. But I suppose one thing that kind of haunted or worried him about his English was that he would always lapse into Irish English, as in Hiberno English. And when he went to translate Gatto into the English language, he actually, once again, brings out quite strong Hiberno English with phrases like referring to somebody as your man, or referring to blather, or the bog. Of course, bogs are rife in rural Ireland. Referring to someone as the mother, with that definite article there. Phrases like, you trying to cod me, fair to middling. Repeated use of muck and muck heap. And that's very the word muck is popular in Ireland, I suppose, because the Irish language muck would be pig. And so there's a kind of association there, which kind of gives it extra heft or weight. The word bollocks is used, and even dodine is used. So that's actually a Hiberno English term for a pipe, which derives from the Irish language word for a small clay pipe. We also have to talk about that reflection on Anglo-Irish politics, Anglo-Irish relations, which is implicit in the relationship between Pozzo and his slave figure, Lucky. Now, of course, this is a reflection on master-slave relationships across the world and can be played that way. But what's interesting is that even in the original production in 1953, in French, in Paris, Beckett told Roger Blanc, who was directing the work, that Pozzo needed to be dressed as, quote, an English gentleman farmer. And in the English language version, he's having Pozzo speak in a posh British public school type of a manner. When he says things like, my good man, or describes something as being of the first water, he refers to the manor where he has his Steinway. He says, I propose to dally with you a moment. And there's that comedic scene where he's very concerned with his social propriety as he tries to wonder how he can sit down again without appearing to falter. So again, kind of keeping a certain stiff upper lip aspect. And the insults that are hurled by Pozzo at Lucky would actually kind of have Irish resonances for Irish audiences. For instance, the negative stereotype of the Irish that you would have had in Punch magazine and other British publications about the pig in the parlor, meaning that pig would be a charged insult in an Anglo-Irish context. And the whole idea that he stinks, the idea of, the Irish being dirty in the eyes of the English, and, this even being a feature of, kind of loads of different, I suppose, propaganda in colonial Ireland and even since. And the things that he asks Lucky to do. such as dance, think, sing, they arguably have anti-Irish resonances in the sense that many commentators from Roy Foster on to others have talked about the fact that there's a certain indulgence that's given to Irish artists within a British context to, kind of say, oh, isn't Oscar Wilde extremely clever? Isn't Bernard Shaw extremely clever? Kind of think for us, Paddy, is kind of the implication. But we're not going to take any of your revolutionary ideas particularly seriously. And I suppose the dancing and singing would have resonances. Dancing, maybe you think of Riverdance, but with the singing, I'm talking about people all the way from back to Thomas Moore in the early 1800s, and how he was so feted in the English drawing rooms and in the drawing rooms of the great and the powerful, and yet they did not give him the preferment that he sought, and that kind of great place that Irish musical artists continue to have within British music culture right up to the present day. And of course, the fact that the parts of the Irish countryside that Beckett loved, such as North Wicklow and Connemara, oftentimes you see scenes where there's just single isolated trees, such as we get in the set of Waiting for Godot. And this has encouraged certain overly excited Irish commentators to sometimes suggest that perhaps the play is set there, but in one of these places, but of course it's not set there. It's not set anywhere in the real world per se. And so, for instance, when Druid Theatre Company actually did open air site-specific performances in both Glencree and North Wicklow, a place in North Wicklow that gets lots of mentions in Beckett's work, and in Connemara, which also gets mentioned not just in Godot, but even in the poetry, we have that making concrete of an Irish setting that arguably is problematic for four major reasons, which is to specifically set it in Ireland, or to, if you like, overstate the Irish traces I've been talking about in the work, is arguably undermining Beckett's authorial intentions to the degree that the play is clearly set, as I say, in a purgatorial space, not the real world. And that Beckett's plays often have both an Irish and a wider European layer, and this play is no different. You might be wondering, well, what do I mean by the plays simultaneously speaking to Irish concerns, but also wider European concerns? Well, for instance, Endgame can be seen as an Irish big house play, but it's also about the European search for meaning post-Auschwitz, as Adorno already mentioned, has highlighted. But also there are references to that place name Cove or Cove to both Irish famines, in the sense that the port from which most Irish emigrants would have left Ireland during the famine would have been Cove in County Cork, and yet Kharkov in the Ukraine would have been the site of a very serious famine. And therefore we've got, again, those two different layers happening at the same time. Take a work like Play. On one level, this is just the latest in a long line of plays by previous Irish Anglican playwrights, or Anglo-Irish playwrights as they're often called, from George Farquhar on through to people like, Oliver Goldsmith, Elizabeth Griffith, Richard Brinsley Sheridan, and further on to people like the Oscar Wilde, who we've been talking about, and Bernard Shaw, in which they look at the English with an outsider's eye and sometimes even mock the English with that kind of critical distance they get from being what Michael Griffin and David O'Shaughnessy have referred to as peripheral insiders within the English scene. But on another level, it's really an English drawing room farce, and fits into that tradition. Come and Go, there's a reference in Come and Go to Miss Wade's, which is a school in Dublin where Beckett's cousins would have gone during the Great War. And in that way, we could see it as kind of Protestant women gossiping, etc., and very specifically, alluding to a Dublin place. And yet there's also allusions to the Greeks, to Shakespeare, and Fritz Lang's film M in that work. So again, a wider European level. Footfalls, as I mentioned, could be seen as a big house play, but as various critics have suggested, it's also an example of Irish Protestant Gothic, such as maybe we're more familiar to seeing in fiction with works by the likes of Charles Maturana or, you know, obviously Bram Stoker's Dracula, or some of the more Gothic works by the likes of Elizabeth Bowen, etc. And, you know, yet for all those Irish resonances, it's also linked to psychological theories of Jung and Janet and the art of Di Messina and Edward Munch. And so therefore, again, Irish, but also wider European. In terms of specifically Waiting for Godot, I've mentioned all these Irish traces, but of course he's talking about the continent's experiences of World War II, and even his own experiences of seeing Jewish friends taken away and killed, and even, you know, kind of having to go on the run with his long-term partner, later wife Suzanne, fleeing to the south of France after the resistance cell was broken up, and the specter of the Holocaust over, you know, all of Europe. So those lines such as "kill me like billions of others," you know, reference to the charnel house, reference to all the dead voices, and even that sense of waiting, which people would have been very, very familiar with, not just during the war, but even in terms of rationing, etc., for many years after the war, again, has a wider European resonance in the play, not just those Irish things that I've highlighted previously. And of course, Beckett indicates that he's speaking about all of mankind and man's existential conditions, whether or not you want to believe that the Godot they're waiting for is God. But he shows the international nature of the proceedings by giving the characters names from various nations. Vladimir, which is Russian, Estragon, which could be seen as French or Spanish, given those are the French and Spanish names for what in the Anglophone world we'd call tarragon. Pazzo is, of course, Italian, and Lucky is a nickname you'd get across the Anglophone world. So I hope I've shown today that Waiting for Godot definitely has a strong Irish pedigree, and there's even Irishness and Irish concerns laced through the work. But again, I don't want to take away from the fact that Beckett is, of course, talking about wider European concerns as well in the play, and of course, all of mankind. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you, David. There is some echo. Well, David, well, I can hear some echo. I don't know. Can you fix that, Álvaro? Microphones? Yeah, thank you. David, that was a fascinating, very thought-provoking talk. Lots of content and much information to digest. So it's amazing to have the chance to hear your thoughts about Samuel Beckett's plays, Waiting for Godot in particular, and performances. So thank you both for your two splendid talks. We do not have much time for discussion, but I'll ask you a few questions just to have a Q&A. Let me remind the audience that they are more than welcome to ask questions themselves. They can write it down in this chat on YouTube, and I'll be able to read them. So, well, I find it fascinating that not only the two plays by these two Irish authors were first written in French and then translated into English, but also that they were first performed in France and had to wait until later for their premieres in England. So, and when you were talking about the reception of both plays, I remember reading Jau's toward an aesthetic of reception and saying that when talking about the terms paradigm and horizon of expectations, I was wondering the readers and writers in a given period read and write within a set of assumptions and conventions that govern their practice, and these assumptions include those about literature, about the nature of genres, style, form, and so on. So, and also about the context of literature. So, do you think that readers and audiences in those periods read both plays within dominant horizon of expectations, which were not shared by their writers, by Weil and Beckett? I mean, if the horizon had been shared, Weil and Beckett would have been immediately understood. and easily interpreted by their contemporaries, but you've been talking about different reactions, and I was really shocked when you, Loredana, talk about Gallian and Joyce, and then the negative reception of Maeterlinck and Yates. So, and then you also mentioned other names. So, could you expand on these issues, please? On these, or even if you think that both Salome and Ways for Godot are cases of chess which contributed to the formation they contributed to change and revolution and a later horizon of expectations, and in which ways? Because they were really unique. I mean,
yeah, well, I suppose the Beckett thing is interesting because I think that a lot of folks that would have seen it, especially originally in French, but even in London in 1955, would not necessarily have been aware of the Irish pedigree of works in which you have some sort of bickering duo kind of waiting, and basically the plot is two people waiting. And so they wouldn't have been aware of that. So they were reaching around for things that might have inspired Beckett. And, you know, I think they were right to think that, you know, Beckett was inspired by things like music hall and, you know, even, you know, films, comedic films, etc. And yet that was just part of the picture. And I think, you know, obviously he would have been kind of penned in to the idea of the theater of the absurd by Martin Esslin, you know, a phrase coined in 1960. And so they would have seen him as well as being kind of in a line with French writers like Sartre and Camus, etc., addressing these existentialist concerns. So I think the reception was kind of kind of all over the shop, and people didn't really kind of maybe even give credit for the fact that Beckett was doing a lot of different things, and maybe even doing more than they expected, and kind of fighting battles on many fronts at the same time, and not just doing kind of one specific thing tied to one specific genre. But that said, I suppose there's that radicalness of Beckett's work that can be startling even now, even when drama has been so influenced by him. There's still a degree to which when you sometimes go see a play of his or read a script, reread a script, you are startled by the bravery of what's going on there, a bravery that was kind of famously praised by Harold Pinter, one of Beckett's disciples. So yeah, I think that the reception's been kind of interesting, and people are still trying to figure out what was going on in this theatrical revolution initiated by Godot and carried on in Beckett's other work.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm glad you went first, because it gave me time to think about, well, in terms of the horizon, Melania, if I can think of what you were asking, well, I think we cannot separate Salome, Wilde's Salome from the fin de siècle. It is crucial to understand what fin de siècle was about, the eccentricity of that moment. And fin de siècle, if anything, tried to go beyond, to explode categories, moral categories, as well as givens. Okay? It would try to conflate, it would try to create hybridity, it would accept opposites. Fun is never an end, it's in fact a new beginning. That fin de siècle expression really signifies to the possibility of going beyond and starting new things, new theater, new drama, new journalism. And Salome can only be decoded through the lens of fin de siècle in that respect. So it was a combination of factors. Because of Wilde's public profile, which was highly controversial already at the time, because of the biblical argument that he touched upon, because of the kind of people that he used to go out with. I mean, the poets, the symbolists that were working alongside Wilde were also his friends. Because of his private life, because of that, Salome was somehow branded quite easily. And when Max Nordau got to the point where he dedicated a whole chapter to him, along with Ibsen and And Wagner, the damage was done to some extent. So it was brave of him and of John Lane, especially, for instance, to believe, to see between the line and of that play, and as a manifesto of a philosophy of life. Art for art's sake was more than just, a well-packed sentence. It was a choice of life, I think, and a choice of living in the end. So, and that stays with Berkhoff. And I'm really sorry that we didn't really have chance, or to see at least a minute of the Camp's production, because what you see there is this attempt to go back to the initial play and see what was this man really trying to do. How did he use this original material, the story of Salome, through to Al Pacino? What you see is this need, from an artist's perspective, to recognize the value of that play, and also show how contemporary it is, because it is contemporary in many ways. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me, we got some comments from the audience. They thank you for your very interesting talks, and they say sorry because they have to leave. There is one. There's one. I'm just trying to find the question, because there is a long comment by one person called Ruth van den Beuken. Grand staff from both speakers. Thanks, David. Would you be able to say something about Beckett's somewhat dismissive attitude towards the gay theatre, despite their attempts to look beyond a narrow idea of idleness? I'm thinking of his letter to Thomas McGreevy's from 1932, for instance. They're doing Romeo and Juliet at the gates when they finished idealizing Wilde's husband. So they goes on. I don't know whether you can read them. So would you like to comment on these? You will be able to.
Yeah. Well, first I'll say hello, Rude, and also, I think that Beckett, especially in the 1930s, he's kind of got a big chip on his shoulder about his relative lack of literary success. And there's a degree to which he sometimes overstates some of his feelings about artistic things, and he's very dismissive. I talked about that essay from the 1930s, Recent Irish Poetry, where he's so rude about the likes of Yeats and other revivalists. And yet these are people that actually remain touchstones for him throughout his career. In the same way, I think the Gate was extremely important to him, and that it really helped form his, theatrical consciousness in many ways. I mean, he was going to things in the Abbey, including, as I mentioned, Yeats's Purgatory when it premiered. But he, of course, was also helping Mary Manning when she wrote Eustace Season. As Rude, I know that you know, he suggested the character of Ego Smith, that silent character that follows Terence Killigrew around the stage. And that's a very Beckett touch, even in the 1930s. And it's a kind of thing that he knew that he could suggest to a play that was going on in the more experimental Gate. But I think he would have kind of been learning a lot about stage pictures and kind of forming great respect for the boys, Micheál Mac Liammóir and Hilton Edwards, even if it's not necessarily expressed in those letters, etc. But I know that our mutual friend Des Lally has shown me a letter that Beckett wrote to Hilton Edwards. It's extremely respectful, from later in the 1950s. And, I think when we talk about the Gate, we also have to talk about its kind of its children, if you want to put it that way. And of course, the Pike Theatre grew out of the Gate in many ways, because Carolyn Swift and Alan Simpson would have previously been assistants to Hilton Edwards, and they, of course, are the ones that premiered Way to Forgato in Ireland in 1955 at the Pike. So, I think that, and then that production was actually brought with a slight cast change to the Gate itself, and the boys actually hosted it in the Gate. So, it's probably, again, take everything that Beckett says in the kind of 1930s with a bit of a grain of salt, including Ireland, calling Ireland the land of his unsuccessful abortion. And I suppose that, you know, this is the character that he's making fun of in a play like Krapp's Last Tape, where he's putting on these tapes of his younger self and kind of is scornful of the use of overly long words and the pretentiousness and the chip on the shoulder that he hears in that younger version of himself.
Well, good. Ruth says, I like the spunk to go to Peter Kind, and such wonderful lining, my dear, all coming from behind instead of in front. Imagine that. And then finally it says, considering both Beckett's and the kids' interest in broadening cultural horizons, you might accept more of affiliation between the two. So I was very interested to hear your thoughts on that. So that's, well, perhaps you can talk to Ruth afterwards. I'm afraid well, that's great, thanks. He says that's great, thanks. Okay, thank you, Ruth, for your comments, and also Nuria and Lucia and many other people. Thank you both for your for preparing these splendid talks and for teaching us so much. And it's been a pleasure to listen to you, and thank you to the members of the audience for the questions and joining us, and hope to see you perhaps in either conference or in ILC, hopefully in person and not online. Okay, so yes. You take much care of yourselves, also the audience, and thanks very much for your for accepting the invitation.
Thank you, Melania. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, Melania, so much. Thanks a lot.
Bye. Cheers.
Bye-bye.